To questions for oral answer, and the first question stands in the name of the Hon Tau Henare.
Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Finance. What reports has he received on the government's financial position?
The Honourable Bill English.
Speaker, the Crown's financial statements for the 3 months to September the 30th were issued today. They confirm the government is keeping its spending under control, but that revenue can be affected by the uncertain global economic situation and its impact on New Zealand. For example, in the first 3 months of this fiscal year, Crown tax revenue was $295 million below forecast, and core Crown interest revenue was $147 million lower than expected. This was partially offset by Crown expenses being $200 million below forecast, including slightly lower than forecast welfare expenses. The operating deficit before gains and losses was $2 billion for the 3-month period.
The Honourable Tau Henare.
Mr. Speaker, what approach is the government taking to ensure it continues to carefully manage its finances so it does return to surplus?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, the government's target is to return to surplus by 2014-15, so that we will then have choices about repaying debt, resuming contributions to the New Zealand Super Fund, or targeting more investment in priority public services. To achieve this, we will need to keep on top of the factors we can control, such as remaining prudent with any new spending and borrowing. We also will continue to focus very strongly on delivering more public services, even where there is less money, to ensure that we support those who need our services. This is important in a world where economic conditions are unpredictable and could have unpredictable impacts on New Zealand government revenue.
The Honourable Tau Henare.
Mr. Speaker, what reports has he received on the global economic situation and its likely impact on New Zealand and the government's finances?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, earlier this week Treasury published its monthly economic indicators for November, focusing on global growth. It notes that more than 5 years after the onset of the financial crisis, the world economy is performing again below expectation. World economic growth in the first half of 2012 was generally below IMF forecasts, and the latest forecast for world output issued last month contained further downward revisions. If global growth does remain weaker than expected, it would affect New Zealand's growth and government finances.
The Honourable Tau Henare.
Mr. Speaker, how is New Zealand's economy performing compared to most other developed economies, and what policy prescription would put this performance at risk?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr. Speaker, we continue to perform at moderate levels, but nevertheless better than most other developed countries. In the first half of this year, New Zealand grew by 1.6%, which is higher than growth rates in the US, Japan, Canada, the UK and the Euro area over the same period. And our quarterly growth rate is about the same as Australia. Policies that would put this at risk would include borrowing more, spending more, and printing money, which would fuel costs for households and businesses and put jobs at risk.
The Honourable David Parker.
How can the Minister stand in this House and pretend that it's good news that the government deficit of $2.1 billion is $490 million, or 27% higher than he projected in his budget just months ago?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not saying it's good news, I'm just saying it is the news. It is the news, and it is a snapshot in a long journey towards repairing the damage that previous Labor government did to the economy and to government finances.
Supplementary.
The Honourable David Parker.
Is it correct that in addition to an increasing government deficit, the New Zealand economy is running the second worst current account deficit in the developed world this year, and is projected by the IMF to have the worst current account deficit in the developed world next year? And if it is correct, does he agree with the Governor of the Reserve Bank, Mr Wheeler, that that's far too high?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, on the first issue, of course we want to see the government deficit coming back. It was $18 billion 2 years ago, it was $9 billion last year, and we're on the track towards about $7 billion for this year and $2 billion deficit the following year. And quarterly figures aren't pushing us off that track. With respect to the current account deficit, I'd take more notice of what the member said if it hadn't been the case that under his government it doubled from 4% to 8%, the worst levels New Zealand has ever had, from the party who is now preaching the loudest about fixing it.
Question number 2, the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Prime Minister.